Good morning, Highlands Presbyterian. So this morning we are in Acts chapter 12, talking about the arrest of Peter. And so Amazon Prime Day was this week. How many of you took part? I certainly did. How many of you bought things you didn't need? I certainly did. There is comfort in numbers. As a country, we collectively bought 375 million items, spending over $12.7 billion. I guess inflation's not so bad after all. Do you know the number one item that was sold? It was cat treats. I wouldn't have guessed that in 1,000 years. Hopefully some of those make their way to Sedona Grace Ministry. The thing that amazes me about Prime Day isn't necessarily their ability to convince me to buy more batteries than I need in a year because they're $2 cheaper than usual. It's the logistics network that they've set up to deliver them. I could press buy on an order and they're ready to deliver it the same day. Our street is evidence of the power of this network. There's a constant stream of delivery trucks and vans weaving their way in and out, stopping to drop off packages at various households. And they do this because you can't stop at an Amazon store on your way home and pick up your order. You have to have it delivered. It's in a warehouse somewhere, and the only way for it to appear at your home is for someone else to bring it, to deliver it. There's no option to pick up. A deliverer is required. It makes me think of our reading today in Peter. So Peter is in jail. He's been arrested. Herod is trying to curry favor with the Jews, and so he's having Christians arrested. And so Peter is being held in jail by 16 soldiers, which helps us to see that even Herod knows there's something supernatural going on. Peter is not Goliath. Peter is not some superhuman soldier. Remember, he's a fisherman. But Herod feels so threatened by him that he has 16 soldiers guarding him. If this was James Bond, we'd say, oh, this is not nearly enough. And you've all seen the movies where James Bond would still find a way to defeat them and get out of jail. Peter is not James Bond. He cannot break out. He needs a deliverer. He needs someone else to come and deliver him from his circumstances. And we're told in verse 5 that the church is praying for exactly this. The entire church is making this earnest prayer that Peter be delivered from jail. So the church is afraid of losing such a powerful leader. So they go home and they pray and they pray and they pray. And their prayers are heard. And they're answered in the exact way that the people ask, because a deliverer arrives on scene. An angel of the Lord appears in the cell, and both sets of chains fall off Peter. The guards are asleep. They do not awake as Peter dresses himself and passes between the guards. Peter thinks it's a vision, but he soon realizes that he truly has been delivered. The church prayed for this, and their prayers were answered as they intended. There's much rejoicing, except for the guards whom Herod has put to death. And in times like this, it's easy for the church to rejoice, as Paul writes in our readings from Philippians. They let their requests be made known to God, and they had peace. And maybe that peace comes from God answering their prayers as they want. But there's an earlier section in our reading from Acts that goes very differently. And we'll step back a little bit farther. At the end of Acts chapter 11, there's a man who foretells this great famine. And so we're told that the disciples were determined to send relief to everyone in Judea. So the church is really interested in serving other people. And you'd think this would be welcomed. But it's not. Because the same Herod that arrested Peter had James, the brother of John, arrested. James, the brother of John, was not delivered from jail. He was beheaded. James was a leader in the church. Herod, again, he's trying to appease the Jews. And surely the church gathered around James in earnest prayer as well. But those prayers didn't have the same dramatic effect they had on Peter. James wasn't delivered from Herod's squads. James didn't march triumphantly out of jail. It's this awful ending for this devoted disciple this leader in the church. The prayers of the church in that case weren't answered as they wanted. We've all been in that circumstance. We've had things go wrong in our lives, and we've sought God in earnest prayer. We ask and we ask and we ask, and the prayers seem to go unanswered. And in times like this, we hear Paul's words to the Philippians differently. We hear Paul to exhort us to rejoice always, because the Lord is at hand and we aren't sure because it doesn't feel like God is near. We struggle to find joy, to find peace. And yet we know that Paul meant what he wrote. And because we can't say that Paul was immune from suffering. In 1 Corinthians, he lists out so many different ways that he suffered. He says, 5 times I received at the hands of the Jews the 40 lashes less ones. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea, on frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from the Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers, and toil and hardship, often without food and cold and exposure. This isn't someone immune from suffering. Paul seemed to be in the midst of daily suffering. He was delivered from these things, but it seemed like picked out of one fire and thrown into the next. He goes on to talk about an oncoming problem. A thorn was given me in the flesh, a messenger of Satan to harass me, to keep me from becoming conceited. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord about this, that it should leave me. We don't know what the thorn was. There are lots of theories, but nobody really knows. What we do know is that Paul was one of the strongest preachers of the gospel in the first century. If there was anyone that we would say deserved to be delivered, to have prayers answered in the way that they ask, it would be Paul. But God said to Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me." Paul's prayer was answered in the way that he wanted. God told him the thorn would remain, and it would be to Paul a reminder of human weakness. However, Paul would still go on to boast of this because he could say that God was still at work despite his human weakness. God was working through that weakness to demonstrate God's strength. And because of that, Paul found the ability to rejoice because God was still at work. Even though his prayer wasn't answered in the way that he wanted, Paul could still rejoice, because he was still claimed by God. And Paul still knew he would be delivered from death. There was an ultimate deliverance, even if there wasn't a temporary deliverance. And it wasn't just Paul. The entire early church was grounded in this idea that unanswered prayers were not grounds for doubting God, because their joy was deep. We see here in Acts 2 entirely different circumstances. 2 leaders of the church arrested. One is delivered, while one is put to death. But the early church doesn't doubt that God is at work. They continue to rejoice in what God is doing. They continue to have faith grounded in the idea that God cares for them. Right? It's an incredibly challenging concept for us to grasp, for us to really hold on to in the depth of our hearts, especially in the midst of suffering. We offer up our earnest prayers, but we can easily be heartbroken when they aren't answered in the ways that we most desire. We talked about this related to mourning when we were talking about VBS and the Beatitudes. There are lots of things to lead us to mourn. We mourn all types of loss in VBS: relationships, jobs, friends, loved ones, pets, our health, countless other things. We lose them, and it leads us to mourn. Some of these are temporary. Some of these are permanent losses. But whenever we mourn, we pray to God earnestly for things to be healed and things to be restored. And sometimes the prayers are answered just as we'd like. Sometimes they aren't. And we ask why, and we wonder, how is God at work? Jerry sent an email the other day with the news story, the fire at the Hilliard Food Pantry. They said that when they arrived, there were 30-foot flames shooting out of the roof of the building. This devastating blow to this vital ministry. No one wanted this to happen. But in the hours and the days that followed, donations poured in, with the Norwich Township Fire Station accepting donations, financial donations, going to the Hilliard Food Pantry. There is much work, much healing to be done. No one would have prayed for this terrible event. But perhaps in the days and the weeks to come, there will be opportunities for the community to grow in knowledge and understanding of the vital role that this food pantry plays. Perhaps the needs of so many will become visible in a way that they weren't, and perhaps the community will draw people closer than they were beforehand. Perhaps the church will find ways to work that we hadn't previously, and the kingdom will grow. God can work through each and every circumstance, and may we trust God even when we can't see or understand what often feels like silence in the face of earnest prayers, and may we learn to anchor our joy deeper than ever in the rock of Christ, so that when storms come, we won't be shaken to the core. And so I want you to hear that when prayers aren't answered the way that we'd like, it's not because of anything we did. Peter wasn't delivered from jail because he was a better Christian than James. They were both faithful believers, wrapped in the love of God, worthy of God's love, and they both had terrible things happen to them. God cared for both of them. And the big picture, remember, is they're both ultimately delivered from death, through death, into eternal life. They passed through the veil and into a permanent state of joy with God. They did so at different times in different ways, and God used the circumstances of both of their lives to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ, who delivers us out of the hands of sin and death and into the grace of God. And so as you go through life and come across things that lead you to God in earnest prayer, let us learn to rejoice in the gift of grace that cannot be taken away from us. Let us rejoice in having an open channel to God, an avenue of prayer that we can follow and know that God hears our prayers. Let us learn to give up control over what an answer to our prayers looks like, to give up the preconceived notion that we know best. Not all healing is physical. God is always intervening physically and spiritually and mentally and relationally, but not always in the ways we imagine. God's ways are above our ways. Just because we cannot see what God is doing does not mean that God is not at work. God still cares and loves you and treasures you and gave his Son to reclaim you. May that give us a deeper joy that allows us to rejoice even in the midst of disappointment. And may we learn to trust God in the same way the early church did, clinging to the one who delivers us from death into life.